To the Honest and Open Conversations members and supporters, I want to wish you all a happy new year. If you're heading out to celebrate New Year's Eve in public, please stay safe. I'm wishing the very best for all of you in 2026. I also want to offer a brief apology. This week's podcast is a recap of my most popular social media post across all platforms. Unfortunately, I've come down with the flu and didn't have any episodes banked, which meant I wasn't able to record a new full episode in time. That said, the recap gives a good snapshot of what's resonated most this year so far. First up are the videos in order covering my take on the Bondi terrorist attack. The Bondi terrorist attack has taken the lives of innocent people, including 10-year-old Matilda. And now the same people responsible for this tragedy are using it as an opportunity to score political points. This makes me angry. Australians have died, and all our leadership seems capable of doing is point scoring. So let's be clear about something. Terrorism is not random violence. It is psychological warfare. Terrorists do not choose crowded places or famous locations by accident. They choose them on purpose. Why? Because terrorism only works if people are watching. Large crowds maximize fear. Iconic locations guarantee media coverage. And global attention spreads panic far beyond the immediate victims. This is not an opinion. That is terrorism research. Academics have been clear for decades. The real target of a terrorist attack is not the people killed, but the public watching it happen. Fear travels further than explosives. Media amplification multiplies impact, and symbolism matters more than body count. That is why terrorists strike busy public spaces. That is why they attack well-known locations. And that is why publicity is not incidental to terrorism. It is essential to it. If an attack happens in a crowded place, in a globally recognizable location, guaranteed to dominate headlines, those factors are not coincidences. They are the strategy. Weak governments do not confront terrorism head-on. They avoid clearly identifying who is responsible, hide behind vague language, blame guns, and hope the story moves on. But ambiguity does not prevent attacks. It enables them. Public safety requires clarity, and clarity requires courage. Something that is clearly missing in Australian politicians and police commands. Now, I'm going to be very clear here because I do not want my words deliberately misinterpreted. To start with, and let me say this plainly, I believe the terrorist attack in Bondi was in all probability an anti-Semitic attack. However, when police refuse to answer basic questions about motive or alleged motive, it becomes extremely difficult to reach that conclusion with certainty. It is well known in Australia that Bondi, on a hot summer Sunday afternoon, is packed with people. Bondi is part of the extremely wealthy eastern suburbs, and not only New South Wales elite, but much of Australia's elite live or stay in Bondi and the surrounding areas. That is precisely why this issue matters. When police continue to refuse basic questions, it becomes impossible to properly clarify motive. Yesterday afternoon, the incompetent New South Wales Police Commissioner, Lanyon, finally stated that ISIS flags were found in the car. that raises a fair and necessary question. Were the victims deliberately targeted? Or was this an attack on a large public gathering that happened to include Jewish people in a location guaranteed to attract global attention because of its international fame? In other words, terrorism. So let me put the issue simply. Did the terrorists go to Bondi to shoot a large number of Jewish people at a religious festival? Or did the terrorists go to Bondi to shoot and kill as many people as possible, and there just happened to be a large Jewish ceremony taking place? Those two questions matter. One points more towards a traditional ISIS style mass casualty terrorist attack. The other points towards a specifically targeted anti-Semitic attack. And when police refuse to clearly address motive, they do not reduce tension. They create it. In an earlier video, I talked about the distinction in how the Bondi terrorist attack may have occurred. This video is about why that distinction matters. We cannot allow the term anti-Semitism to go the same way as words like racist or Nazi, labels that have been diluted into meaningless slogans, used to shut down legitimate argument instead of clarifying the truth. The Jewish people and the Jewish nation can least afford for the term anti-Semitism to become meaningless. And on this issue, there is another critical failure that incompetent police and politicians have refused to address. What anti-Semitism actually is. This is not splitting hairs, especially deeply flawed hate speech laws now in place. Australia's special envoy to combat anti-Semitism relies on the non-legally binding working definition established by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which states, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and their property, towards Jewish communities, institutions, and religious facilities. This same definition is also used by the United States Department of State. However, in their infinite wisdom, the Australian Federal Police use a different definition. They define anti-Semitism as the demonstration of hostility, prejudice, or discrimination against Jewish people or Judaism as a religious, ethnic, or racial group. That definition lowers the threshold, it muddies the concept, and is ultimately weakens what anti-Semitism actually means. And that will harm Jewish Australians in the long run, not protect them, because when words lose meaning, warnings stop working. The Bondi terrorist attack did not happen in isolation. It happened because of multiple failures. And as much as the mainstream media, police command, education institutions, and politicians want to avoid responsibility, it is entirely appropriate and necessary to ask very difficult questions. When politicians and police, who are ultimately public servants, dismiss those questions or refuse to answer them, it demonstrates exactly the cowardice and corruption that led to the failures which allowed this tragedy to occur. Police commands in New South Wales and across other states and within the federal police have demonstrated repeated incompetence. And yet, once again, Australians have been assured that a so-called thorough investigation will be conducted. The reality is simple. It can be reasonably argued that Australians no longer believe the police. I certainly don't believe these bodies are capable of conducting proper investigations because they are politically compromised and politically captured. That reality ends any honest debate about whether police remain independent from their political masters. I'll give Anthony Albanese a tip. What terrorists want more than to divide us, and what they are counting on, is that you and your gutless, personally motivated, low intelligence cabinet of ministers continue to refuse to acknowledge reality or take decisive action. While you do that, you continue to destroy the relationship between police and citizens, creating exactly the weakness terrorists exploit and allowing them to continue tearing at the culture around them. And let me be very clear about this as well. If the Governor-General will not dismiss this Labor government for gross, negligent homicide, then the Constitution is no longer worth the paper it is written on. Chris Minns alluded in briefing to the fact that a clear pattern had formed leading up to the Bondi terrorist attack. And yet Minns and the rest of the flawed politicians at the state level have done nothing substantial to protect innocent people. By the way, Minns, here's a presentation tip. You only have to pretend you're tough when you lack capability. This isn't a personal attack driven by anger. It's a demonstration of a broader truth. Weak politicians are all show and no substance. What we are witnessing right now is a convergence of political elites exercising power against the wishes of the nation's founders and against the best interest of the Australian people. History is very clear about what happens next. Civilizations collapse under this exact pressure. One of the defining characteristics of a collapsing civilization is the adoption of tribal, totalitarian, collectivist ideology. That is when society stops seeing individuals and starts seeing groups. And when that happens, civilization doesn't advance, it degrades, it devolves into uncivilized barbarity. That's not a slogan, that's not rhetoric. I'm paraphrasing my understanding of the work of Professor Victor Davis Hanson, a historian who has spent decades studying how civilizations rise and how they fall. And this is what that collapse looks like in the real world. It looks like two gunmen slaughtering 15 defenseless people who are enjoying a Sunday afternoon at Bondi Beach. That is what happens when ideology replaces civilization. That is what happens when leaders abandon responsibility. And that is what happens when a society refuses to confront reality until it is standing in blood. Restricting firearms while police cannot be relied upon leaves ordinary Australians unable to protect themselves or their families. Whether people like that truth or not, it is a reality. What happened in Bondi is evidence of that fact. This tragedy is the result of gross political incompetence, systemic corruption, failed policing leadership, and a media class more interested in narratives than truth. These are the factors that allowed the Bondi terrorist attack to occur. Every single politician in the federal parliament, along with former politicians including John Howard, John Anderson, Tony Abbott, and Scott Morrison, as well as current and former state politicians across the country, share responsibility. Many of you have participated in this system for decades. And the two-party system bears responsibility for every single death in Bondi. Because preferential voting demands loyalty to party power rather than loyalty to the country, the state, the electorate, or the people who put representatives into Parliament. We do not realise the vision of our nation's founders and demand that both Labor and the Coalition stop putting self-interest above the people, then the terrorist attack at Bondi is only a taste of what is to come. This nation will collapse into a tribal, totalitarian collectivist system where all that matters is group identity. The voting system is corrupt, undemocratic, and deeply flawed. It allows idiots not only to rise to the so-called leadership positions, but to remain there. Whether you call it collectivist, socialist, or unconstitutional, as long as this system stays in place and rewards incompetence, Australia will continue to decline and become more volatile. It already has. Just look at the past 20 years. In 2005, people identified with Islamic ideology attacked innocent Australians, leading to the Cronulla riots. The media and the Howard government claimed there was no underlying ideological issue, just drunk racist. In 2014, the Lint Calf siege occurred. Again, we were told it was a mentally ill Muslim acting alone, misrepresenting his faith. Islamic ideology was not to be questioned. If you did, you were labelled racist or Islamophobic. And once again, it was the guns' fault. In 2015, police employee Curtis Cheng was murdered. Again, not as a result of ideology. Again, if you held Islam as an ideology to account, you were racist or Islamophobic. Again, it was the guns' fault. In 2017, the Brighton siege occurred. Another individual aligned with Islamic ideology killed a receptionist and injured 3 police officers. Once again, do not hold the ideology to account, or you are a racist and Islamophobic. Between 2001 and 2021, 52 ADF members were killed and 263 wounded fighting people identifying with Islamic ideology. In that example, the ideology held to account was the so-called toxic masculinity of our Special Forces soldiers. Which brings us back to Bondi. Once again, we are told not to hold the ideology to account. And if you do, you're a racist or Islamophobic. All that is required, apparently, is to further restrict law-abiding Australians from owning firearms. Now, if you misarticulate yourself on social media, the police commands that have failed Australians to date will send their members to your house for hate speech violations, which could put you in prison. But yet again, if you affiliate with Islamic ideology, you're excused because politicians ultimately don't want to lose votes. So unsurprisingly, at Bondi, it's the guns' fault again, and absolutely nothing to do with Islam as an ideology. Even Islamic scholars acknowledge that Islam is a violent ideology, which is fundamentally incompatible with Western civilization, liberal democracy, and the Australian way of life. There are other questions that need to be addressed, and they must be discussed. Questions that Premier Minns and Commissioner Lenyon appear determined to avoid. Eyewitness accounts are widely recognised in psychological research as unreliable, particularly under extreme stress. That matters. It means we have to be careful with allegations. But it does not mean serious questions can be dismissed. So here is the first one. Allegations have emerged involving foreign nationals, not Australian citizens, who have been accused of exaggerating or falsifying injuries connected to this attack with the intent of advancing a political narrative off the back of a national tragedy. I want to be absolutely clear. I am not making that determination. I am asking whether or not these allegations will be formally investigated. If injuries were deliberately misrepresented for political purposes, then Australians deserve to know. And if that conduct involved foreign nationals exploiting an Australian tragedy to inflame tensions while emotions are raw, then a further question follows. Will those individuals and any organisations involved be held accountable? And if wrongdoing is established, will their presence in this country be reconsidered? Because the last thing Australians need right now is foreign political activism built on falsehoods, imported into this country at a moment of national grief and instability. Which leads to another unavoidable question. Did some police freeze and fail to meet the expectations of the New South Wales public, as has been alleged? Now, even if the answer to that question is yes, That takes nothing away from the two police members currently in critical condition. And suggesting that asking critical questions somehow attacks those officers is an insult. It is an insult to the brave police members fighting for their lives in hospital right now. It is an insult to the wider police force. And it is an insult to the people of New South Wales when injured officers and innocent deaths are used to shield political leaders and police command from scrutiny. I want to be clear why I'm raising this. In my own experience in high-pressure situations, not shootouts, I have seen police freeze and panic on multiple occasions. I have personally been placed in danger because a New South Wales police officer panicked and unnecessarily deployed his weapon, putting me and others at serious risk. So when this issue is raised, it is not theoretical to me. This brings me to standards. For decades, the public have been told that all groups are equally capable of policing, under the misguided belief that diversity can substitute for merit. That belief is dangerous. Policing is a profession where physical capability, psychological resilience, and competency under pressure are non-negotiable. When standards are lowered, lives are put at risk, which leads to another question. Based on my own observations and off-the-record conversations with police officers, when recruits graduate from the academy, those who would have met older physical requirements are often sent to regional postings. Those who do not meet those older standards are more commonly placed in major metropolitan areas, where additional resources exist to compensate for individual limitations. That matters, because I have also watched video footage that ran for a substantial period where police were largely absent from the frame. Based on my experience observing police response times in metropolitan areas, it appeared to take far too long for police to arrive. If that assessment is correct, Police Command has serious questions to answer. That delay is unacceptable, particularly when police leadership claims they were prepared, yet the observable evidence suggests otherwise. Here is another legitimate line of inquiry. Budget minimisation. Given the media has legal and research teams, they should be asking whether police resources were reduced to meet budget targets. The gun licence questions are entirely appropriate. They represent a failure of the Police Commissioner's office and the failure of the Federal Police and ASIO to flag the Philippines trip of the killers to New South Wales Police is a failure at the federal level. The Federal Police Commissioner is in the same position as Premier Minns. She can talk tough, but command failure means responsibility. And if she had an ethical backbone, she would resign due to gross incompetence. And if the Bondi attack was missed because federal police resources were shifted away from counter-terrorism into cyber units, particularly those policing speech-related laws, then the federal police leadership should resign in disgrace. This point matters because it connects directly to what was visible on the ground that day and what authorities failed to detect beforehand. I am not a firearms expert, but I do have experience with firearms and tactical firearms training. Hunters, as I understand the discipline, train for accuracy, not speed. The objective is a single controlled shot, ideally one round that causes the least possible damage to the animal's body while ensuring a clean kill. That is hunting. Speed-based long-arm practice is something entirely different. Training to fire multiple rounds rapidly is tactical training. In that context, the objective is maximum damage in the shortest possible time. That is not hunting. It is not recreational target shooting. It is preparation for violent engagement. That distinction matters. And what makes this even more concerning is what is visible in the footage. Initially, both terrorists are standing upright. They do not appear to assess themselves as under immediate threat. It is only when they begin crouching and moving behind cover that tactical awareness becomes evident. That transition demonstrates threat recognition, use of cover, and movement discipline consistent with training, not panic. That should be the central question investigators are asking. Where did they learn that? Where did they acquire that knowledge? Where did they learn to recognize threat, use of cover, and transition postures under pressure? And it may expose how deep and how rotten this terrorist attack really goes. Now, I also want to talk about the brave hero, Ahmed al-Ahmed. We have all seen the footage. The courage demonstrated by this man is genuinely inspiring. The heroes of Bondi give me hope that there are still people willing to stand up for others, willing to act, and willing to defend the Australian spirit and culture that makes me proud to be an Australian. But a difficult hypothetical question has to be asked. If this brave man had shot the terrorist and fatally injured him, would the New South Wales government have charged Ahmed al-Ahmed? You can argue a jury would likely not convict him, but the charge itself, the legal process, the cost, the stress, and the need to defend yourself are part of the punishment. Politicians will deflect from that question, but the deflection itself is the answer. And that reality matters because it tells ordinary Australians exactly where they stand if they act to defend others. Which brings me to another issue that has to be confronted honestly. I have been a supporter of Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price for many years. I believe that if she could avoid the corrosive ideology of major party politics, she could be a leader worth something. But based on a recent statement on this issue, it appears to me that she has succumbed to the same poisonous ideology. And that places her in the same category as the political operators in the major parties who are driving this country into decline. Let me explain why. First, absolute free speech is at the core of a healthy democracy. That is non-negotiable. Under the two-party system, both Labor and the Coalition have shown they are perfectly willing to erode that principle when it becomes inconvenient. Any serious limitation on civil liberties should be put to the people at an election after open public debate. But that is not what happens. Under the corrupted two-party system, both major parties routinely take actions that were never put to the public and never meaningfully debated. Now, the chant from the river to the sea is abhorrent. I want to be clear about that. But if you are an Australian in Australia, you should be allowed to say what you want. That principle matters, even when the speech itself is repugnant. At the same time, this example demonstrates something else entirely. It demonstrates the importance of scrutiny on immigration. If Australians do not want to hear that chant, and the majority agrees, then the government should not allow people who hold those views into this country. They did. And now Australians are told they must simply accept it. Once again, under the flawed two-party system, politicians believe they have the right to act unilaterally, without public consent, on core civil liberties. In this case, Senator Price supports parliamentary action that would crush free speech and freedom of association. She is wrong. This is not community-based thinking. It is collectivist thinking. Islam as an ideology, whether radical or not, is incompatible with Australian values, culture, and the way of life. That reality should be stated clearly, not obscured to appease voters or political interests. On firearms and self-defence, Senator Price has also abandoned logic. The right to defend others, even at the cost of another life, is an ancient legal principle. In both recent tragedies at Bondi, Westfield, and on the beach, The only thing that stopped the killers was armed intervention. Yet once again, she supports the crushing of civil liberties without the people's consent, just as previous governments have done. That is undemocratic. I am not advocating direct democracy. Politicians must act within guidelines on day-to-day matters. But they do not have the moral right to strip fundamental liberties without first seeking public approval. Under the collectivist, flawed voting system that entrenches the two-party monopoly, this power is handed to politicians. That is why Australia increasingly resembles a uniparty system, one that is more authoritarian than democratic. The fact that Senator Price's first concern was Jewish Australians specifically rather than Australians as a whole is further evidence of collectivist thinking. Group first thinking is at the heart of the two-party system. It is undemocratic and it will destroy this country. The more group-focused a nation becomes, the more uncivilized that nation becomes. There is also an additional danger here that is rarely acknowledged. When politicians and media speak in ways that imply special treatment for one group, they do not reduce anti-Semitism. They risk amplifying it, metaphorically painting larger targets on Jewish Australians' backs. In my opinion, this is exactly what certain media figures are doing. And when political leaders indulge or validate that framing, they are making the problem worse, not better. The concerns of Jewish Australians are the concerns of all Australians. Collective safety does not come from carving out exceptions. It comes from equal application of law, equal protection, and equal responsibility. As a long-time supporter of Senator Hanson, I am concerned that this same poisonous ideology is beginning to infect one nation. If that continues, Australia will be left with no meaningful opposition and no real hope. When I have the proper equipment, I intend to invite Senator Hanson for a long conversation to discuss these concerns and the future of this country. I hope she would accept. I have been highly critical of much of the political establishment, and I believe that criticism is justified. But this podcast is not simply political, it is cultural. I would sit down with anyone I have criticised, give them the right to reply, and have a long, honest, and open conversation with them. That is only fair, and that is what real discourse looks like. Everything I've said in these videos and have witnessed about the Bondi terrorist attack brings me to a point I wish were untrue. And to be clear, it is not something I want to be the case. But it is now impossible to ignore. Based on the past 25 plus years of mainly coalition but also Labor governments, the October 7th invasion of Israel, and more specifically the last 2 years here in Australia, combined with the Bondi tragedies, the conduct of mainstream media, police commands, educational institutions, and the broader elite class, it is fair to conclude this, regardless of how much I wish it was untrue. Australia can no longer provide the Jewish people with the guarantee of personal safety that any community has the right to expect.
The next group of clips received significant support on either TikTok or YouTube.
Husband Charlie, he wanted to save young men just like the one who took his life. On the cross, our Savior said, "Father, forgive them, for they not know what they do." That man, that young man, I forgive him. I forgive him because it was what Christ did and is what Charlie would do. The answer to hate is not hate. The answer we know from the gospel is love, and always love. Love for our enemies and love for those who persecute us.
Wow, Erica Kirk is an amazing woman. In her grief, she's shown the strength to forgive her husband Charlie's killer. That's leadership. That's faith. Men should strive to be like Charlie. Lead your families. Speak your mind. If you're too afraid to be honest with your woman, she's the wrong woman. Women should strive to be like Erica. Find an honourable man who speaks truth. Stop giving your hearts and your womanhood to losers. And women should remember this. You are the gatekeepers of sex and relationships. If you can't find good men, ask yourselves why. There's been a lot of talk about self-defence laws and the castle doctrine, mostly from dumb politicians and commentators. If they're honest, they'd admit the truth. This needs to be federal law, or better yet, a constitutional amendment. Here's the reality. Australia's self-defence laws are broken. If you defend your family, and if the police don't like your politics, guess what? That's premeditated murder. The only real fix is the castle doctrine. Your home is your castle and you should have the absolute right to defend it. But that's not the case at the moment. Here is just one of many roadblocks. John Howard's idiotic gun reforms. The very tools you'd need, semi-autos and shotguns with real capacity, are banned. Here's a hard question. When the police, the politicians and the courts can't, or better still won't protect us, what then? Until Australia answers that question, criminals will stay emboldened and ordinary Australians will stay defenceless. And if you want more, I've got a full podcast coming, because this is exactly why Honest and Open Conversations was born. To skip the talking points of mainstream media and to have these conversations with every individual Australian.
Honest and Open Conversations podcast exists because too many people are afraid to say what needs to be said. Honest and Open Conversations is where we stop pretending and start talking like adults. Some weeks it's me, other weeks it's a guest with the guts to speak honestly. We talk about mental health, politics, the decay of culture, faith, masculinity, Australia's future, and what happens if we keep pretending everything's fine. If you're looking for safe, curated, or politically acceptable, this is not for you. Episode 1 starts with me being honest about my life. I start with my story, the truth about what woke me up, and why I refuse to stay silent any longer. First episode drops Wednesday, 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Follow on every platform and go to honestandopenconversations.com.au for early access to membership events. If you believe this country needs a reality check, don't wait. Be there from the start.
I started high school already carrying more weight than most kids my age, and Barrel High made sure that weight got heavier. From the very beginning, it was clear there was a hierarchy. Year 12s ruled the school grounds. Year 7s like me were at the bottom. One of the first things I heard from an older student was simple. We're going to bash you. That was the welcome. But here's the thing. Those seniors, as tough as they were, they also had a code. They enforced discipline in their own way. Brutal sometimes, but fair. I remember one time we were picking on a special needs kid. At the time I didn't think of it as bullying. I thought we were just mucking around. The seniors thought differently. They herded us onto the basketball courts, blocked the exits and hit hockey balls at us. They weren't weak. These were rep-level hockey players. It hurt. But you know what? I never mucked around with that kid again. That's how discipline worked back then. Immediate, harsh, but it worked. Another time, 2 boys were having a blue. The seniors stood back, watched, made sure it didn't go too far. Then the older brother of one of the boys jumped in, trying to tip the scales. A senior stepped in, hit him once, broke his nose.
Message clear. It's not your fight. Stay out of it. Now today people would call that barbaric. They'd call it abuse. But I'll be blunt. Back then we called it respect. And compared to the chaos in schools now, maybe we've lost something. ADHD and autism diagnoses have skyrocketed, often rooted not in biology but in attachment failure, trauma, overstimulation, and perverse government incentives. I know of a case where parents shop for a diagnosis, got one, and educators, health professionals supported it because it unlocked funding. Call it corruption, call it incompetence. Either way, it's a disgrace. And we wonder why Medicare and NDIS budgets are blowing out. Over 100,000 Australian children under 14 were prescribed psychotropic medication last year. Gender clinics, modelled after the now shattered Tavistock Clinic, have quadrupled referrals since 2015. Puberty blockers, SSRIs, and antipsychotics, drugs that permanently alter the brain, are now part of the state's toolkit for managing the dysfunction it created. We're drugging children to cope with the environments we imposed and calling it progress.
Once again, thank you for your ongoing support. To the members, jump into the groups and let me know what you think. I've got a few things planned for January that I'll be announcing early in the new year, and I'm genuinely looking forward to what's ahead. Stay safe, and thank you again for your support. It means a lot, and with your help, we're building something very strong together.